TE Talks with Guides is a weekly podcast for lovers of history, travel, and all things Italian. Welcome back, everybody, to TE Talks, sponsored by Through Eternity Tours. I am your host, Rob Allen, and on TE Talks, we get to talk to some of the most fascinating people who make a living out of being wonderful storytellers. We get to delve into what drives their passion. And today, I'm very happy to have a special guest, John, one of our great TE guides, who is, in fact, one of my favorite storytellers. So, John, welcome to the podcast.
Ciao, Rob. Through Eternity Tours has been my home, you might say, for the last 10 years or so. Hi, everybody. My name is John. Thanks for the great storyteller. Thanks for having me here also at the headquarters, Rob. Obviously, this is a podcast, but I'm a tour guide. And I'm not an actor. I'm not an academic. I've never made a podcast before, but I've made thousands of tours. So it may seem a bit like a tour in spots. So please bear with me. Like they say in Italy, il lupo perde il pelo, ma non il vizio. The wolf sheds his fur, but not its vices. Basically, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. After 27 years of tours, it's my first time talking in public in a year and a half. It will be my pleasure to show you one of the most beautiful areas of Rome.
Okay, great. So you're telling everybody that you're in the office. It's a special kind of rendition of the podcast because normally we do it over Zoom, but I thought since you live close by, it would be great to have you come by. So you have been working with Through Eternity for about 10 years, you said?
About 10 years, yeah.
I remember very well when you came into the office and introduced yourself, that you also worked as one of the main guides at one of the poshest hotels of Rome beforehand. You supervised other guys at the Hassel, correct?
Yes, certainly, for years.
And you also got to take many celebrities around, too.
We took around some celebrities, but they're not as nice as the Through Eternity clients. So
of course. But you did, because I have used that picture from time to time. I asked for you to take Drew Carey around when we had him, right?
Certainly.
There you go. So, John, we are going to be covering today because, you did such a wonderful job on the video of the Aventine Hill with the TE Destination series. The Aventine Hill itself, I thought, since you studied a lot for it, and since the video itself is only about 5 to 10 minutes, we could talk a little bit more about the Aventine Hill. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your discoveries and your preparation for the video?
Apart from my discoveries, what I've been seeing for years going to the Aventine Hill, but what I thought to do a little bit different from the other podcasts, just because it's the way I do as a guide, I figured first we have to arrive to the Aventine. And the easiest way to arrive would be just to take the subway, get off at the Metro B, Circus Maximus stop. But I figured the best way to arrive, the most picturesque way, is from near my house anyway, near Porta Pia, to take the tram number 3. It's not always so fast, but it goes by some incredible sights on the way to the Aventine Hill. And first we see St. Lawrence Basilica. You might remember that from Rob's tour. And the San Lorenzo Quarter. This was practically the only area of Rome bombed in World War II. And I noticed for some reason that in 27 years of being a guide, people always ask me, was Rome bombed in World War II?
Yep,
and that's practically the only area where it was bombed. It was also where Maria Montessori started her first school. Then we passed the Aurelian Walls in Porta Maggiore, also on the tram. The Porta Maggiore was the main gate. It was made at the conjunction of several aqueducts. As the name indicates, it's the biggest gate on the Aurelian Walls.
The major port.
The major port, not the major port, the major door.
Yes, the major gates, right?
The major gate.
Yeah, because of Porta. Porta.
Porta is the gate. Porto is the port.
Yeah, perfect. Yes, your Italiano is always much better than mine, but you've been here for a lot longer. So basically, John, you took the scenic route when you came
the
to
scenic route, but just the public tram.
Yeah, it's a great public
tram.
You
The
can
number
see
3.
sites that are often not seen by people.
But they're super important. And then, because after the Porta Maggiore, you get to Santa Croce, the Holy Cross Basilica. This was built by St. Helen. She was Emperor Constantine's mother, and she's the one who brought back the remains of the Holy Cross from Rome. And she had the church built to install the remains of the Holy Cross. We're talking about 700 years back.
Did you ever hear a story about that? Because I've always been curious about St. Helen. St. Helen, I had read that she died out in the Holy Land, that she sent the stuff back, or sometimes she came back.
There's different stories, in fact, but there's different stories. But the nice thing is always that, there's a lot of different stories. Who are you going to believe? Who's the real story? But that's what makes it nice. Like they say, if it's... how does it go? Se non è vero, è ben trovato. If it's not true, it might as well be true. So sometimes the story has been around so long that it's just as true as what could be the real truth. You don't even know what it really is.
Okay.
But if you go there today, the first thing you notice when you're passing on the tram is one of the most beautiful late Baroque facades in Rome. Santa Croce was a major stop on the pilgrimage route for over 1,500 years.
Yes.
When visitors to Rome were here more for religious than cultural or touristic reasons. But in 2011, the monastery was closed in disgrace after various scandals, which mostly we won't mention here, but a part had been converted to a luxury hotel for celebrity parties. Madonna's was the most famous party there. There was even dances around the main altar by a notorious ex-pole dancer who has since become a nun.
What? You're talking about 2011 this happened?
2011.
And then it was converted into a hotel?
Part of the monastery was already converted to a hotel, but in 2011, Pope Benedict disbanded the whole thing after the pole dancer was dancing around the main altar.
I had never heard of this. And you said Madonna had a party there?
She had a party there too.
Did she have it in because...
Not the mother of Jesus, Madonna.
I know what you mean.
Madonna the singer.
Of course, but hold on a second. So where are they having the party? Because,
in the luxury hotel.
And the luxury hotel.
It was a venue. It was used for parties and stuff like that.
That's hilarious. I never knew that she had a party there. Did they use, because have you ever been, maybe our listeners don't know, or maybe you were going to talk about the fact that the palace of St. Helena, now the church, was attached to the walls, Aurelian walls that were built beforehand, but part of it was the Teatro or Amphitheater of Castrenses.
In fact, that's what I was just going to say you, that it's right next to the church, the Castrense Amphitheater. And it's like, if you look at it, it's like a smaller Colosseum, but for centuries it's been just a garden where the monks grow herbs. It's a vegetable garden where the monks grow herbs.
Yeah, I wonder now, are they still... Yeah, they are still. I've been there. Have you ever been inside?
Yeah, certainly. They're pretty expensive, but even though they disbanded the order that part of the order that was doing the things, most of which we didn't mention because we have a good quality audience here.
You'll tell me later.
But in any case, the vegetable garden, the herb garden is still there.
Huh. What order was this?
This is Cistercian monks. They get around.
They do get around.
Then we pass by San Giovanni in Laterano, St. John Lateran's Basilica. This is the seat of the Bishop of Rome, who is better known as the Pope. And right next to it, the Claudian aqueduct runs alongside of the Scala Santa, the Holy Steps. These are the steps from the Praetorium. This was the official palace of Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem. Jesus climbed these steps several times during his passion. Now you climb them on your knees, and it's a good-sized set of marble steps. So when you go there, you have to make sure you have a lot of time.
Oh my God.
And some good knees. And some good knees.
Did you go there like over a year and a half ago? I think it was in 2019. They had
they took off the wood. Because generally they're covered with wood to protect the marble. Exactly. And you say, how could the marble wear out? But if you see in some of these old churches, the steps are completely worn through. Sure. So they had covered them with wood, which they would just change periodically when it got worn out to protect the steps themselves. And they had and they still do, now that they're recovered with the wood, they still have the little glass inserts, the little windows where you still have to look for when you go there, but you can still see the spots of blood embedded in the marble, spots of blood from
I actually went up there on the marble.
On your knees.
Yeah. I did.
You go up on your knees.
I did. I went because I had some friends who they were having their twins baptized. And so I had a gift for them, and I carried the gift with me, and I went up on my knees with the exposed marble. Yeah.
And it led to the Sanctum Sanctorum.
And have you been into
the holiest of the holies? You can't go into it, though. You can see it from the little windows.
Yeah, but you can go to it.
But sometimes you can go, but most of the time you can't. I mean, so just the viewer, don't think they're going to climb the step on their knees and go inside. But it's got a little window you can look into it. And they kept the holiest of the holies, including a lot of the most important relics. Because this was the palace of the Pope. Up until the late 1300s, the popes lived there and not inside the Vatican.
Yeah, but I mean, have you ever been? Because if you go around the corner of the chapel, they can open that beautiful ancient bronze door and go inside.
But even the mosaic on the outside wall was something that was in the dining room of the Pope's palace. Yeah. Because it was a huge palace, and the popes all lived there. When St. Francis came to Rome, he met the Pope at the Lateran. If he went to the Vatican, he just went as a pilgrim. But when he went to meet the Pope, he had to go there. That's why right across the street is that huge statue of St. Francis.
Of course. Oh, well, I didn't know about that statue. That's why it was there.
Because he came there to ask Pope Innocent
to start
permission to start his order. Excellent.
That's really cool.
Because everything took place there. Everything took place there until the late 1300s when the Pope came back from Avignon.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. In fact, I talk about it on my virtual tour about St. Peter's, that it was actually St. Peter's, the old Basilica by Constantine, was really initially the spot for the Byzantine emperors when they would come in to Rome. And that St. John, what you're talking about, was the seat of power for the popes.
But even today, when the Pope first gets elected, one of the first ceremonies, they call it the possession, is he goes across town and officially takes possession of St. John Lateran.
Yes.
They used to do it with the procession with the white mule, but now he walks and there's all the TV cameras following him, etc. But it's still the first thing officially the Pope does as Pope is to take possession of St. John because it's still his official church. In fact, when you go in St. Peter's, what do you see? The papal throne. It's up on the wall. It's enormous. It's gigantic. It's beautiful. It's made by Bernini. It's 50 feet up on the wall. But he couldn't sit in it. They'd have to put him up in a crane. But in St. John, what is it? It's something more simple. It's medieval, but it's down on the floor. Or he can sit in it right behind the altar. So officially, technically, even though it's not done anymore, that's his official seat.
That is the cathedra.
That's the cathedra. That's the seat, because in Latin, cathedra means seat. So the cathedrale, the cathedral, is where it's the seat of the bishop. And what's his first title? The Bishop of Rome. And so he has to be able to technically sit in it. Even today, although he does it from the Vatican, what do they call it? When the Pope makes an official pronouncement, he's speaking ex cathedra, because he's speaking theoretically from the throne. He doesn't have to anymore, but technically he's speaking from the throne.
Symbolically. Okay, cool.
After you pass St. John's, you come to the really big names, the Colosseum, the Arch of Titus, and the Arch of Constantine. I won't say anything about them because they're already wonderfully explained in the Through Eternity Ancient City Tour. But just as important as those is the Palatine Hill. We pass next, completely covered by the Imperial Palace complex. Then come the ruins of Circus Maximus, which still amaze us with their sheer size. It's still the biggest sport complex, but now we'd call it an entertainment venue ever constructed anywhere, anytime on the planet. Right now, it's all set up for the open-air opera season. And past the racetrack, we're finally at the Aventine.
Yes.
You wonder when it's going to arrive there.
Well, Bennett, it's like, so remember, everybody, Tram 3.
Tram 3.
Public transport, not that crowded usually. It gives you a great view of the city.
And then finally, the tram goes up Viale Aventino, Aventine Avenue, which is a commercial street which divides the Aventine peaks and arrives to the Pyramid of Caius Caesius, which is also on another tour. You knew that Rome was the only ancient pyramid in Europe and the only white marble pyramid in the world.
No, I didn't know it was the only white marble.
Sure you knew that, Rob.
No, I didn't know that.
Through eternity. I myself have only been in it once in my entire life.
I heard it's really small.
It's tiny. It's tiny inside. It's smaller than this room. You couldn't fit a car inside hardly. But it was only for one person. And it was just for his ashes, so it didn't have to be too big. Then you get to the Via Marmorata, the so-called Marble Street, and you'll get off at the Tiber River, where people worship the river god Tiberinus. The Tiber was the lifeline of ancient Rome and the site of the main river port. So this was an incredible trip for €1.50. I'm sure I forgot something. There's a lot more even than that.
That's fine.
When you get down from the tram, you get a great view of the Aventine from below on the river road, the Lungo Tevere. You see a piece of the Servian wall, 2,600 years old. You see massive retaining walls and ancient ruins, all topped with monasteries.
Sure.
But what about the Aventine? What is and where is the Aventine? What's the geography? It's the southernmost and most isolated of the original 7 hills. The boundaries are north from Circus Maximus to south along Via Marmorata, the Marble Street, running from the port to the Ossian Gate, west to the Tiber River and east to the Celian Hill, past the Baths of Caracalla in the beginning of the Appian Way. The Appian Way, the Regina Viarium, the Queen of the Roads.
Sure.
Originally, the Appian Way was finished almost at Circus Maximus. Actually, the Aventine is 2 hills, or 1 hill with 2 crests.
Yeah.
The Aventino toward the river and the Piccolo Aventino, the Little Aventine, also called San Saba.
That's right behind the Baths of Caracalla.
Right across, yes, behind the Baths of Caracalla, right across the Aventine, Viale Aventino.
Yeah. The destination video that we did, we spent the bulk of it on the main Aventine.
And then afterwards, you crossed.
We went to the Baths of Caracalla, which was next to it.
But it was right at the very edge of the slope.
Yes.
The street is the commercial heart of what is still even now virtually the only residential area of Rome, and certainly the only one within the Aurelian walls. The Aventine is all gardens and posh residential buildings, churches and monasteries. Practically the only commercial activity is on Viale Aventino. Along with its beautiful vegetation, this gives the Aventine its unique sort of a garden-like setting. It's an oasis of calm in downtown Rome.
Yeah, it's a bit of a big posh area today for people to live in.
But it's really strange, the fact that you don't have stores and things. Because it's really in the center. It's the only area. Even the Colosseum has stores and bars right across the street.
All over.
Spanish Steps, the Trevi Fountain, everything, the Vatican. But this is just residential.
Yeah.
And old monasteries
in
and
the
gardens.
middle of the city. It's funny because it's very beautiful, but often very posh areas in London, Paris, or New York, I often covet them. I would love to live there, to be able to afford to live there. But the Aventine, for the fact of what you just point out, that there are no shops, there's no way to interact with people, I would feel isolated. That's why I don't think I would like to live there. It's nice to visit, though.
In fact, you have to go down to Viale Aventino to get a quart of milk or something.
Yeah.
It's not right there.
No.
So I guess after the geography, we got to have a brief history. After all, this is a podcast. And when you climb up Clivo di Roccasavella, you pass along the medieval walls of the 12th century fortress of the Savelli family.
Yeah, I remember that street because you pointed it out in the video.
The Savelli family.
Yeah.
Which are still around, but the medieval branch started off in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, they're not the mosaic sellers next to the Vatican.
No. These people had at least 2 popes in the family. But when you're going up that street, it seems like you're really going back in time. It's one of the most area of Rome where it seems like, I won't say it looks like in ancient times, but it looks like a medieval traveler would have seen it. It's like that or the street by San Giovanni and Paolo. There's few places in Rome because even the oldest things, the Colosseum, you see buses crossing in front of you.
Yeah.
But it's something that it's like a medieval traveler would see, like going out on the old Appian Way.
Yeah, I remember very specifically my first time going on a moped ride. A friend took me around and we went up because I don't think you can do that anymore, but we went up on that road on a moped on the Aventine. And I thought, wow, this place is really different. It's when I started to fall in love with the city because it does transport you to different times.
It does. It looks like you're going back in time.
Mm-hmm.
In the Aventine Hill, though, in the very oldest time, in the ancient times, and we're talking about the foundation of Rome, was Romulus's brother Remus's headquarters. And since it was Remus' headquarters, it's always known as a place of outcasts. the ancient Aventine was always mercantile. It was populated by conquered foreigners during the Roman monarchy and republic. So what they would do is they conquer the people to get more people for the town because they didn't have enough of people living there. And I think really, I always thought one of the most fascinating aspects of Roman history is a series of conquests and enslavement. Rome was repopulated constantly by conquered foreigners and mostly freed slaves who eventually became citizens. These new Romans conquered other people and enslaved them. It's been estimated that when Rome was at its peak with well over 1 million inhabitants, 50% or more of the free people were no more than one generation from slavery. 50% or more. These were the kind of people who inhabited the Aventine Hill. You would think
freed slaves,
freed people, recently freed slaves. Somebody's father was a freed slave, businessman.
I always got the impression when you talk about that, about freed slaves, and I don't deal with it enough on my tours about like the everyday people. I end up talking more about the elite class. That I got the impression from my studies that they were really much better with their money. Because you hear about the aristocrats running out of money, and that they were smarter because I guess they understood when they didn't have that much money to start with to become wealthy.
But it was the kind of people, but I mean, the common people who were descendants or freed slaves themselves was one thing over in the Aventine. But when Rome was really at its peak, some of the wealthiest people in the city were freed slaves. In fact, even in the famous books like what do they call the Dinner of Trimalchio, the most famous dinner that's always described in ancient Rome, he was a freed slave. In fact, they were notorious for the amount of wealth they had, but also for how tacky they were and how they spent it. So I mean, they were wealthy, but they were tacky. And the thing is, you would think that the ex-slaves wouldn't have slaves. But it's like when the Hebrews were slaves to the Egyptians. I'm sure it was really a terrible thing. But when the Hebrews weren't slaves, they had slaves. So it wasn't that they had anything against slavery as a concept. They just didn't want to be slaves.
Sure.
And that was basically the idea for the whole Roman Empire and the Romans themselves. Everybody, and slavery was a part of life. I'm not defending it, but it was a part of life. But it's not that they had anything against it. They just didn't want to be them. So a person, like you said, I mean, some of the wealthy people, it was like, if you were a slave and you were smart enough to make enough money and to get yourself free, because you had to buy your freedom in most cases.
Sure.
And once you were freed, you could go where you wanted because you were smart. Because what the owners would generally do, because we tend to think of slaves, you think of people picking a cotton on the plantation back in the 1800s or something.
Misery, yeah.
But the slaves, most of the time, were paid.
Sure.
Maybe not the farm slave, but slaves in general were paid or paid in some sort of a way.
Well, you talk about doctors being slaves, scholars.
I mean, doctors were slaves. The bankers were slaves. Some of the most famous Roman writers were slaves. So you had people who were slaves who were really some educated people. In fact, it was something that many times the slave was more educated than the master.
Sure.
So, I mean, like if you were a Roman, for instance, and you wanted your children to get a good education, you could buy a famous Greek scholar when they conquered Greece and use him for your children's tutor. He was a slave, but he was a lot more educated than you were. But you're sure you're getting your children a good education.
Sure.
Plus, also as a status symbol, the better slaves you had, the more top Roman you were. I mean, it's like, we got Sophocles for the kids. Who you got? I mean, it was a status symbol. It was prestige to have good slaves.
But when people were slaves, okay, because this is a really interesting subject, right? So if people were slaves, you have to imagine that, did they have rights or were they treated as objects?
Slaves had technically by law no rights whatsoever.
Exactly.
You could do what you wanted, and apparently people did what they wanted with the slaves.
You could even kill them.
But in practice, I mean, yes, you could even kill them. But in practice, there were some rights introduced after centuries. But in practice, that they didn't do it. But it wasn't because of a law against it. It was just for social mores or norms or something. I mean, it's like, I mean, like for instance, Rob, you got your slaves. and your slave breaks your favorite Greek face. And you could beat your slave to death and nobody could ever tell you anything. But after that, it's like, Rob, look at him. He's beat another slave to death. I mean, it looks pretty bad with the neighbors or something like that. So
one would hope.
It wasn't so much a legal thing. It was more of a social, unspoken thing. Mm-hmm. But also the fact that, obviously, you got these people, they're everywhere. They're all around you. In fact, it's not just the super upper class. Even, a middle-class shopkeeper would have a slave to do the dirty work. It wasn't just, but these people are there. They live with you. They're literally everywhere. And so they're right up there. They know everything. They see everything. They're so literally intimate with you. In fact, the Romans called them the familia. They were part of the family. Sure. So it's something that, was really an intimate relationship with them. You're not going to kill somebody who's almost like your son or something like that. Sure. In fact, who was Cicero's, his copier, the one who Cicero would dictate all these things. He was the most prolific writer that survived to us. And he dictated all these things to his slave who was called Tito. Mm-hmm. But they got letters from his brother, and Tito's asking, and his brother, Cicero's brother is asking, how's Tito doing? I heard he got a cold. I heard he had the flu. Is he okay? Is he surviving like this? Mm-hmm. They literally became part of the family, but he was more than just somebody who took notes. He could read and write. He was an educated person. He was more like an editor. In fact, when Cicero died, who edited and compiled all this stuff was his slave Cicero. Mm-hmm. And certainly with the passage of time, some of these slaves like this, they were freed. Just for what they did. Their owners freed them because they were so close to them. They were just part of the family. But you could buy also the freedom. Yes. In fact, the thing is, like a lot of the slaves, they were paid, not because the Romans were particularly generous people, just because they realized the slaves worked better. They had a little incentive. Sure. If you're just a slave and you're doing what you have to do, you're going to do the minimum. But if you get paid for it, you're going to do more. So like if you pick your share of cotton, if you pick more than your share, you get paid for it. So you put aside a little bit of money. Mm-hmm. And what's your hope is to buy yourself. You're buying your freedom. Mm. And so many of them did that. So I think more were actually bought their freedom than actually, who's a really famous example? You could not only buy your freedom, but you could even buy Roman citizenship. And if you were a freed slave or a Roman citizen, you became a Roman citizen. Mm. You couldn't vote, but your children could vote. Or you could vote, but you couldn't run for public office. Mm. There's a little bit of discrepancy, but you certainly couldn't run for public office. But your children could even run for public office.
So through generations.
So this freed slave thing was something really, really strange to us now. But it was really important to the Romans. This thing,
part of their society.
The freed slaves. But right. I digress.
Yes, but no, it's a fascinating discussion. Mm-hmm. So, getting back to the Aventine.
The Aventine. But so it was always inhabited by this sort of a plebeian class. Mm. What we call a plebeian class now was literally called the plebeian class now. Mm. And this was in the Roman monarchy in the first, 300 years. Romulus and Remus, the first 7 kings, the first, roughly 300 years of the 250 years of the Roman, what we call Rome. Then the Roman Republic was another 500 years or so. And the Aventine was always a plebeian area. In fact, it was where the 3 successions of the plebeians took place. This is getting more historical. When they retreated to the Aventine Hill in the struggle for their rights, because they were one class, the patricians were the other class. But they weren't getting their rights. They were the workers, but they weren't getting there. They didn't feel like they were getting their rights. So they went on strike and they refused to collaborate and cooperate with the patricians. And finally, the patricians realized they couldn't do without them. Mm. And the recognition of the plebeian rights started after these various successions. Mm-hmm. And they started to get some rights back in the 4th century before Christ. So it wasn't yesterday, no? Sure. The Aventine was also the last holdout of the populist faction of the Gracchi brothers. Uh-huh. And the Gracchi brothers faction, they were back in 123 when the patrician thugs killed off most of the holdouts.
123 BC.
123 BC. And they killed off most of the holdouts after the revolt. in the Temple of Diana on the Aventine Hill. So they were holed up on the Aventine Hill, even still that late a time compared to Roman history. So it was originally like a working class neighborhood. Yeah. It was near the port where the food supplies and the marble arrived. But it was really unusual because of this plebeian kind of outlook. But it was in a unique position because it was inside of the walls, the so-called Servian walls, but it was outside of the Pomerium. Sure. Now I'll say a little thing about the Pomerium because our listeners might know, what is this Pomerium thing? The Pomerium was the official religious and legal boundary of Rome. Rome was a sacred area. Yeah. The original Pomerium apparently was plowed with a white ox by Romulus himself, April the 21st, 753 BC. The origin of the Pomerium has to do with the Latin word wall, but it really didn't in practice conform with the wall. So the wall and the Pomerium were two different things. You had the defended area was inside the walls, but the official area of Rome that was in the Pomerium. And anything outside the official area was the Ager, the holdings of Rome, the land of Rome. Sure. Like if you're at Ager Vaticanus, that was never considered part of Rome, the Vatican area. So this meant being protected, but also outside of the official holy area, they could have temples to foreign gods also, like Bonadea from Magna Grecia, or the Etruscan goddess Juno Regina. As well as traditional Roman gods, because they had the temple to Diana, they had the temple to Minerva.
These are all temples on the Aventine.
On the Aventine Hill, but I just mentioned a few because, we're not here to make a lesson. So the Aventine was always and still is a religious center. Many, though, of the foreign gods were taken and absorbed into the Roman system by evocatio. Evocatio. What is this evocatio? What is this? It seems strange to us now, but evocatio was a religious and a military ceremony where a Roman general, who was also a priest, evokes or summons the foreign protective gods, the foreign deities. He evokes them, but this is during a siege. It was psychological warfare. Sure. It undermined the enemy's sense of security. It was also a good excuse and a way to avoid sacrilege by looting the temple's treasure, because you couldn't loot another temple, but if the god wasn't there anymore, you could. Sure. So it gave you a good excuse for taking away all the treasures and the famous statues from all over Greece and the Near East and wherever they got them from. So this was something that the Romans because the Romans couldn't sacrilege anything, even if it wasn't their own. They couldn't do sacrilege. It's like the wars. The wars always had to be a just war. They always had to ask God permission to make a war. God always gave permission. Sure. Because it was the priests who asked, and it was the priests who were the politicians, and the priests who were the generals. So he generally gave permission. But Juno Regina on the Aventine Hill was apparently taken this way from the Etruscan town of Veio back in 396 BC. And the evocatio was a ceremony where the priest, who was a general, basically called on the foreign god. It's like, hey, Juno, these Etruscans, they're a bunch of losers. Come on over to Rome. You're going to get a much better temple. You can get priests who worship you 24/7. And then if they won the war, they had to do it. So that's how they got a lot of their gods. That's simplifying, but that's how they got a lot of their gods. Yeah. They basically stole them from other people. It wasn't enough just to absorb them. They even stole them.
But it's interesting because it's like this behavior is, of course, strange for us, but that they believe that these gods were living in some way or were alive to be negotiated with, to have diplomacy with the gods, not the people of the town, but let us be diplomatic and set up agreements with you. We'll build you a greater temple. We will worship you more. It'll be to your best advantage to join us, and then we can just destroy.
But if it works, then they got to do it.
Yeah,
because otherwise the god's going to be mad with you.
Exactly, and they did.
But like you say, you made a good point though, that the Roman religion in general, apart from taking other people's, it was like an agreement with the gods. In fact, the religion was nothing like we think about religion now. It was, I mean, if you look at their religious texts, there's not too many survive, but it's like a legal contract. It was like, it was like a legal agreement with the gods. And in fact, it's no accident that today we think of the separation of church and state. But in ancient Rome, it's exactly the contrary. The priests, the military, the politicians were one and the same. They were exactly the same people. In fact, so many people, so many of our listeners, for example, might not know that Cicero was a priest or Julius Caesar. He was a priest. He was high priest. He was Pontifex Maximus. Besides being a politician and one of the greatest generals ever. So the upper class people were generally priests. They were politicians and they were general because the generals were always politicians.
Sure.
And they were generally priests as well. So it was the religion, the politics, and the general and the military was the same thing. In fact, what did Cicero even say? He said, aren't the Romans the most fortunate people that ever lived because their religion and their direction is the same people. It's the same people.
Interesting. They all had, like, the elites had their specific positions that they had to get, like a certain stepping stone. They would go up the ladder.
In fact, some of the religious positions were not as good, depending on the kind of career you wanted. Because someone like Julius Caesar, when he was young, he had been appointed a priest. And I have to say, I forget which
the Flamen
he was. Yes, I think it was the Flamen at first. But the problem was they couldn't leave town for more than 3 days in a row. So how could you ever be a general? You wanted to be a general. You wanted to be military. You wanted to be a politician. You wanted to make a name. You wanted to make money. So he had to get out of that. But when you were a high priest, it didn't matter. You could go where you want, etc. So, I mean,
sure, of course.
So it didn't matter if you went on overseas campaigns and got glory and money. It was away for years and decades. But he was Pontifex Maximus, the high priest.
Yes.
And even today, the official title of the Bishop of Rome, Pope Francis, who's better known as the Pope, is Pontifex Maximus. In fact, you hear about the pontiff or his pontificate or something because he's still got the title of the ancient Roman high priest.
Yeah.
But just as a curiosity, well, you know this already for sure. I mean, when Constantine legalized the Christianity and made the Pope a official figure, and the popes were not killed anymore, and the priests and the Christians were not killed anymore for their religion, he didn't give the title the Pope.
No.
High priest. He did the Pope. He kept the title of high priest.
That's right, because the emperors kept it.
Constantine kept the title of high priest in the beginning. After a long time, they gave it to the popes.
Makes sense.
And the popes still use it today, but Constantine didn't give away the title of high priest because he was considered, in fact, you hear him many times called the one who converted Rome to Christianity. Yeah. Or they call him, the first Christian emperor, but it's really debatable because he legalized Christianity. I mean, that's a historical fact. He legalized Christianity. But if he ever became a Christian, it's completely debatable. He did a lot for Christianity. He built a lot of churches and things like that. But whether he ever became a Christian is debatable. And even if he did, it was probably when he was about to die. He was about to die. And a lot of important figures did like that back in those days. They did any way they wanted. He wasn't what you call a good Christian person. When the Christians in North Africa were having a different type of Christianity than the type they use in Rome, he sent down the troops that wiped out 100,000 people.
Oh my God.
So he wasn't what you call a good Christian person. No. He had one of his wives and at least one of his children killed. And apparently the son he killed personally himself. Crispus was killed personally, apparently by himself. So he was not what you call a good Christian person. So what these people would tend to do is when they're about to die, he'd make the baptism.
Just in case.
Just in case. It was like an insurance policy, just in case. But he wasn't what you call a good Christian.
Do you have any good books that you've read about Constantine? I know there have been a lot. I mean, it sounds like you've got some good info about his family, which was very cutthroat. Although I think of his mother as a saint.
That's hard to say. But not only is she a saint, But in the non-Catholic Christianity, like the Orthodox, even Constantine is considered a saint. In the Greek Orthodox, Constantine, in the Romanian Orthodox, he's considered a saint.
Wow.
But he certainly wasn't a holy person, for
sure.
He took power illegally, like most Roman emperors did.
Yeah.
And personally killed off the one who was more than him anyway, the rightful ruler of Rome. So Maxentius.
Sure.
So he was not a nice guy, but he was effective and he was political and he was considered one of the greatest generals the Romans had. And this religion thing came a little bit after, but he wasn't the first Roman general or politician to come in on religion. I mean, what did Julius Caesar do with the whole cult of Venus?
Sure.
My family is descended from Venus. We got a reason for taking total power and totally destroying the first republic that had gone on for 500 years. Why are we destroying this and taking total power? Because we're descended from God.
Yeah.
Son of God was a good position to be in ancient times.
Yeah.
You think of a few, no?
Sure. Didn't work out well for him, though. Did for his adopted nephew.
Did. But also he kept up the religion. He kept up the religious aspect. Yeah. What did he do when he moved the temple of Apollo down into his palace?
Sure.
And what does the writer say? He said, now we have two gods living right next to each other.
Wow.
So, I mean, he couldn't make it more obvious than that.
Sure. So getting back on the hill?
Yes, getting back on the hill. But later on, I mean, after centuries of the plebeian Aventine Hill and the monarchy and the republic, during the empire, it really became more of an aristocratic area.
Sure.
Vitellius, the emperor, had a residence there. Trajan, before he became emperor, lived on the Palatine Hill. Wealthy people in general. And because it was such an elite neighborhood, that's why it was really heavily damaged toward the end of the empire by the sack of the Goths.
Wow.
So a lot of damage was done just because it was a wealthy area. It was where there was a lot of things to sack. Then when you get to the medieval times, like most of Rome, the Aventine was in ruins. There were churches and monasteries, but not many people living there. These places were built over as foundations, but also using the pieces of ancient pagan temples and baths. But not only the churches were built of the spolia, the ancient fragments. Even the entrance doors of houses, like you saw in the videos, were built of ancient fragments, sometimes with the inscriptions. Then, just to wrap up the history, jumping ahead to more modern times, in 1924, it's interesting that when the anti-fascist parliamentarians wanted to revolt against Mussolini, who had been in power for a couple of years, but he didn't have total power yet. It was still a bit shaky.
Sure.
So what did they do? They symbolically retreated to the Aventine Hill to protest the fascist assassination of the opposition leader Giacomo Matteotti. So the fascists had killed this guy. Everybody knew it, but they couldn't come right out and say it. So they retreated to the Aventine Hill. They made the symbolic Aventine retreat in the hope that the king would dissolve Parliament, which he never did. In fact, it didn't last, and within a fairly short space of time, most of the successionists ended up dead or in fascist jails. So
you would think
it didn't work out.
Why would they try to recreate something of history which had a bad ending originally?
No, the original had a good ending.
Well, the Gracchus got killed.
Well, the Gracchus got killed, but that wasn't one of the Aventine successions. The Aventine successions eventually got the plebeians their rights.
Oh, and so
But not only the plebeians got their rights, because the plebeians, mainly the Romans, gave them the rights because they were the ones who were more industrious. They were the shopkeepers, etc. And it eventually became what you maybe call the capitalists now.
Sure.
In fact, later on, in Julius Caesar's day, when he made the famous first triumvirate, he was the only patrician of the three. Pompey, who was the other most important general, even more important than Caesar at the time, and Crassus, who was known as a general, but who was known as the money man. He was the money man behind it all. They were patricians. He was the wealthiest person in Rome, but they were patricians. So it didn't mean anything to do anymore with your upper class or lower class. It was just different at that point. And they did get their rights. They not only got their rights, but mainly they got wealthy. They were able to do all the things the patricians did. In fact, by Julius Caesar's day in the empire, time being patrician didn't make that much difference. In fact, since certain office was only open to plebeians, there were even patricians who had themselves adopted by plebeians so they could be a plebeian and run for that office.
Yeah. But also, later on, though, Caesar did use the fact of his original aristocratic connections, that he was one of the family Julia was one of the original founding families of Rome. And later on, when Augustus, who was his nephew and then adopted son, was very adamant about distinguishing the classes.
Yeah, certainly. In fact, Augustus tried to bring it all back. Yeah. He tried to bring back the old ways, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But most of the old ways that you see are the old customs that Augustus adopted. A lot of them were just, like Thomas said, a lot of them were just invented by Augustus, and they were completely anachronistic. Mm-hmm. There were things the Romans hadn't done in years, but they started in with these old religious customs that had been just these really minor things that hadn't been done in years, but it was all just to promote him.
Sure. So things for his advantage.
So what was the whole thing about? I mean, even the Pantheon and all these things, it was just about promoting the family as gods. So, and he obviously did much more than Julius Caesar did.
Yeah.
About taking total power. Julius Caesar did, in a way, take total power, but they still had the Senate. But when Augustus was there, it was just all figureheads. There was nothing like a republic anymore. That's why, even still, when people say, Julius Caesar, he was the first emperor. No, he wasn't the first emperor. Augustus was what we call the first emperor, the first prince, the first of equals, because Julius Caesar never got that kind of power.
No, he didn't. But he was the catalyst for the republic becoming the empire. But I was just thinking, though, when you were talking about this group, going into assedio, to protect themselves on the Aventine Hill, still really didn't get the idea of that, because they're hoping who is going to intervene for them? The king of Italy. That's nothing to do with the Gracchi brothers, because, during the Roman Republic, the Romans despised any person with the title of king. They were not allowed to enter into the pomerium, right? They were not allowed to enter into certain sacred areas of Rome because they despised kings so much. So these people had a half-assed experience of history, and they ended up having a very sad ending, right?
But obviously the times were different, but it was just that if you think about it, even the most uneducated person in Italy at the time, when they said we're making the new Aventine succession, would have got the connection.
Sure.
So it's something that everybody had learned about through their grammar school and their formative education. Everybody would have known the Aventine succession. So when the parliamentarians retreated, when they abandoned the parliament, they called it the Aventine succession. So it was something that was just to put it in mind of it, but obviously it wasn't a direct thing with it.
Yeah. Well,
so that was pretty recent, not even 100 years ago. And nowadays, what is it? The Aventine is really like a posh residential area. Mm-hmm. It's still full of medieval monasteries and really nice gardens. It's got the incredible views. The Savelli Fortress is now one of the most beautiful small parks in Rome. The so-called Giardino degli Aranci, the Orange Garden. Mm-hmm. So it's known for its views. It's known for the residential area, but there's not really that much to see from the ancient times.
No.
But it's got that history. And now that you see a bit about the geography and history, we'll see what are some of the Aventine monuments that are still visible.
Which are pretty amazing.
Which are pretty amazing for sure, although they're not, to be honest, so much the ancient things. Actually, I think from what I understand, although some of the things are not visible today, they've been excavated by archaeologists, but like most excavations are covered up again.
Yeah.
There are some remains of the Temple of Diana under a restaurant that you could see, but only if you eat in that restaurant. But there's not much to see of the ancient things, part of the old walls and things. But the medieval things are the more important. Or the late, not even medieval. The St. Sabina Basilica is late empire. Rome was still an empire, but had become Christian. And the Santa Sabina Basilica is dedicated to Saint Sabina, obviously, who was a martyr around the time of Emperor Hadrian. And she apparently lived on the Aventine Hill and was converted to Christianity by one of her servants. Okay. Because Christianity in general was not the other upper class people in the beginning. It was the lower class people, the servants, the slaves, the soldiers. So she was apparently converted by one of her servants, then became a Christian, and then got her head chopped off.
Of course, like as one does.
But when you go into the basilica, it really looks like it would have looked like 1700 years ago. Sure. It was built over ancient houses, like everything else was, over ancient houses, ancient monuments, ancient temples. But one of them was apparently that of Santa Sabina herself. But it was partially over the site of the temple of the goddess Juno, the one I mentioned you before.
Sure.
It was constructed, apparently, with mostly materials from the temple. And this was to show the triumph of Christianity over the pagans. But it saved a lot of time. It saved a lot of money.
Yeah.
These ancient columns were nice.
Just killing two birds with one stone.
And killing two birds with one stone. So it was really a win-win situation in any case.
Sure.
And really something quite unusual for Santa Sabina is that all the columns are the same. So they had a really nice temple. They basically demolished the whole thing and got those. Because if you go in, like later on in the hill, we'll see San Saba, every column is different. You go in Santa Maria Trastevere, there's no two alike. So this, they got a nice set, all nice and preserved, and used it for the basilica. And so that's why it's really considered to be the best preserved original layout of all the ancient basilicas. It's not really so huge like St. Peter's Basilica or some of the others, but it's really impressive. It's over 200 feet long. And it's simple, like the ancient basilicas were. But I really think you could say majestic. It's got that aspect because it's just so simple and so severe that it's got that, you could call it really majestic. It's the mother church of the Dominican order since 1222. So it was already around as a church for 800 years by that time. St. Dominic himself stayed there, and you could still visit the cell where St. Dominic stayed.
Yeah, you got to visit there, you said recently.
In fact, when you go there, there's usually a Dominican priest hanging around the doorway, and if he's not doing too much, he'll take you up to the cell. You don't even have to tip him or anything like that.
And you said there was an important conclave that happened there?
Yes, in fact, it was a seat, because nowadays we think of the Sistine Chapel, and even the guys, we always say this is where the papal conclave take place. But obviously they didn't take place there before it was built, and actually even they didn't all take place there after it was built.
Yeah.
But this was long before it was even built, and the popes weren't even residing yet in the Vatican. And in 1287, they had a papal conclave at Santa Sabina, the basilica, and the monastery next to it. But the cardinals had to leave the church after an epidemic killed 6 of them. And only one of the cardinals, apparently, had the courage to stay. They finally came back the following year, and they elected the new pope. It was the cardinal who stayed.
Got the courage to stay.
But the fact that he was from the Savelli family, who owned the fortress right next door, that might have had something to do with it. Maybe had something to do with it. But what it's really famous for, I mean, now you got your art historians, when you're thinking, like Thomas and Caterina, etc., they'll know it for the doors, the original doors from 432. But I mean, it's an overused expression, but these are one of a kind in the world. Yeah. They're the oldest known example of wooden Christian sculpture that survived. They are also the first known public exhibition, the first known public image of the crucifixion. In a scene of Moses, who's about to drown in the Red Sea, he had his face recarved as Napoleon in the early 1800s by an anti-Napoleon, pro-papist person who was restoring the doors. So
of course.
1,400 years later, he converts the mean pharaoh into Napoleon, about to drown in the Red Sea. They get their little little revenge sooner or later. Something else that's pretty interesting, although not unique to the Santa Sabina, is the use of selenite instead of glass for the windows. In ancient times, they had glass, but it was really a luxury item. It was mostly blown glass, so it wasn't used for windows.
Yeah.
Occasionally, they'd cut it while it was like a blown bottle that was still hot and fold it into a sheet, but that was really not cost effective, so it wasn't used for windows. Windows in common houses really didn't have panes. They had shutters. So in the wintertime, you had to choose between cold and dark, open or shut.
Pretty drafty.
But in public buildings, the windows were often thin panels of translucent stone. You see those huge openings in the buildings, like the Basilica of Maxentius in the Forum and those other buildings. They had windows that weren't open, but they were made of stone. And selenite was one of the materials they used, or they used mica or alabaster, like you see in not the old ruins. You don't see them that much, but where you see this in other early Christian basilicas, like St. Paul's Basilica has alabaster windows.
St. Paul's outside the walls.
St. Paul's outside the walls. So it was something that they'd use it instead of windows. So it lets the light pass through, but you can't really see through it. Because they had the glass, but they didn't really use it. In fact, you remember that exhibit in the Forum a few years back about Roman glass. There were amphoras, there was cremation urns, there was glasses and cups, but there was no windows because they didn't really use it for windows.
Interesting. So the windows are made with glass.
The windows with the flat sheets were glass was a completely different technique. And as far as I know, but this has nothing to do with the tour, the really time they first did it in big production was as late as the 1600s when they made Versailles.
Sure, with the mirrors.
So many windows and mirrors, and they had to have something new. They couldn't just, look at medieval churches. The stained glass is all little pieces.
Sure.
So they didn't have big pieces. They didn't
have huge production
windows
for it.
But Santa Sabina is one of your better examples.
Okay.
And the most famous square in the Aventine area is the Piazza, the square of the Knights of Malta. Mm-hmm. It's got the Priory Church, and it's still the residence of the Knights of Malta.
Sure.
Not exactly ever since they were chased out of Malta by Napoleon. They spent a few years in Russia under the protection of the Czars.
Were they in Russia?
Oh. When Napoleon first chased them out of Malta, they were in St. Petersburg.
Sure, they didn't go to Rome.
But then after they were pretty rowdy. So apparently the Tsar got rid of them and the Popes let them stay in Rome. They've been here ever since.
Huh.
And actually, this is not part of the tour either, but the Priory on the Aventine, their headquarters down by the Spanish Steps, and also their other building in the Roman Forum are considered by Italy extraterritorial.
All three of them. Wow.
Some countries like America don't consider it a true country. Mm-hmm. But Italy and most of the Catholic European countries like France and Spain have an ambassador to the Knights of Malta.
Wow. Must have been interesting.
Even today, they don't make money, but they make stamps.
So they were probably part of the agreement with the Lateran Pact when the Vatican City was created because the popes brought them here.
But it's still, even Italy considers them
interesting.
Extraterritorial. Their land is extraterritorial.
Okay, and so to finish up with the square, it was designed by Piranesi.
See, in fact, it's considered to be the only architecture ever completed by Piranesi. Mm-hmm. Because how do we know Piranesi? Piranesi is considered to us to be one of the greatest engravers of all time.
Sure.
In fact, all these incredible engraving views you see of scenes of Rome and the Forum, etc. In fact, you even see them like in the lobby of public buildings, etc. They're by other people also, but the majority are from Piranesi. But he considered himself an architect. Mm-hmm. But one of the only things he actually completed was the square and the buildings of the Knights of Malta. Mm-hmm. The square is also famous for the keyhole.
Yeah.
But I don't want to say on the podcast what you see when you peek through the keyhole because I don't want to spoil the surprise.
Well, they can see it on the video.
No, you have to come to Rome. You have to come to Rome, listeners, and see it for yourself because that's the important thing. Uh-huh. So you have to come to Rome to see it because then I don't want to spoil it for you. Nearby the Santa Sabina is the other more famous church on the Palatine. It's the Santa Prisca Basilica, and generally considered the oldest Christian site on the Aventine.
Really? Older than Santa Sabina?
Mm-hmm. It's thought to correspond with the house church, like they generally
before they were legalized,
before Christianity was legalized.
So it was a titular.
The house church, the titular of Aquila and Prisca, who were mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. They were friends of St. Paul. And it's supposedly where even St. Peter and Paul were lodged when they were in Rome.
Mm.
But it's actually dedicated to another Santa Prisca, who was a first century martyr baptized by St. Peter on the same site.
Mm.
But the archaeology, more scientific, shows us that it's built over the house where Emperor Trajan had his townhouse in pre-emperor days. And so this confusion, it beautifully demonstrates to us the difficulty of separating history from legend in Rome.
Mm.
But why would we even want to?
Mm.
And that is really the magic of the Eternal City. That the history and legend is so intertwined. It's like, they say, if it's not true, it might as well be.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't even separate.
Well, there we go.
Trajan's descendants remade it partially, the old house, into a pagan temple a century later. And also the pagan temple was dedicated to the god Mithra, the Persian god,
that's beautiful.
but partially into a Christian sanctuary.
Okay.
But around 400 AD, the Christians violently destroyed the Mithraic part and incorporated it into the church. And this behavior was typical as Christianity as soon as it was legalized. In the church is the baptismal used by St. Peter to baptize St. Prisca.
Oh.
So they say.
So they say, according to...
No way to prove it. Mm.
All right.
On the other Aventine peak, San Saba Basilica is from the 7th century. And typically of Rome, all of the columns are different inside the church.
Spoglia. Mm-hmm.
Spoglia. The 13th century, this is for our art history listeners, the 13th century cosmotest floor is famous because the art historians consider it to be one of the best preserved in Rome. In fact, it's better preserved than the one in Santa Sabina.
It's a beautiful floor.
And it's got one of the best.
I remember going there because the Baptists, remember when I told you I went up the stairs, the Scala Santa on my knees? So my friends who were getting their children baptized was at San Saba. And one of my friends is a joker. He likes to provoke. And he basically said, oh, Rob will be telling everybody about the Church of San Saba. I had never been inside the church. And then the priest was there to listen to my explanations of the church as well.
Mm.
So to put up on the spot.
But even the floor in San Giovanni across the street in St. John's, right across the street from the Scala Santa, it's not as nice as the one in San Saba.
No.
Because it was reground back in the time of Borromini.
Sure.
So when they regrind them, they don't have that bumpy aspect anymore.
Which is beautiful. It makes it richer.
They're bumpy because the colored stone was semi-precious stone. The marble, the white stone, is a lot softer. It just wears out, so it gets all bumpy in spots. So San Saba is considered one of the best preserved of all of them.
Yes.
But right near San Saba, on the edge of that part of the Aventine Hill, you can end up with the very edge of the Aventine, and really the magnificent, you really had no way other to call them than that, is the Baths of Caracal.
Yes.
And they're not the biggest, but they're certainly the grandest and the best preserved of all the imperial bath complex.
Yes.
And generally, I don't say a lot of statistics, but when you think they're built more than 1,800 years ago, and they're more than 1,100,000 square feet. That's a big place.
Yeah.
They were to accommodate 1,600 people at any given time between the bathers, the exercises, the art lovers, and people just there to socialize or meet their friends. And apparently they were doing 6,000 or more people a day, because obviously you didn't spend your whole day. You could spend as long as you want, but you didn't spend your whole day there. Apart from the baths themselves, because we think of a bath now as just a place to wash, but apart from the baths themselves, there were steam rooms, there were saunas, there was a workout area, swimming pool, two libraries, a food court, a temple, meeting halls, and dozens of shops. All this was in this really incredible setting, lined in exotic marbles. And they were paved in some of the most important mosaics of ancient Rome. And it's exactly marbles. You think Italy is a country of marble. Mm-hmm. But most of the marble in Italy is like these pieces you see in your floor here. Most of it's coming from Carrara, which is basically white or grayish white. All these exotic marbles, like you see on the Palatine, you see all over these old churches, they came from all over the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. When you see the porphyry marble that came from Egypt, or the ones that come from Mesopotamia and Greece or something, or from distant Turkey, the Cipolline marble, almost from Afghanistan. Sure. And you think, why would the Romans go all that way to get these really exotic marbles when you had Carrara that's just like a 3-hour drive from Rome? Because they could.
Yeah.
Because it was exotic, it was expensive, it showed you were wealthy, it showed you had the money to get something like that. Mm. It showed you were powerful, it showed you could conquer these people. You took their stuff. You didn't ask for it.
Sure.
You go over there and buy it, you took it. It's yours after that. You could take it after that. So that's why you see all these things. In fact, you have more porphyry stone, mm-hmm. Probably the most exotic of all. It's even considered a semi-precious stone. You got more of that in Rome than you do in Egypt.
Yeah.
You have more Egyptian obelisk in Rome than you do in Egypt.
Of course. Well,
so with all these things and this beautiful setting and all these exotic marbles, and it's got some of the most important mosaics of ancient Rome. It's got some incredible statues and works of art. You still see them all over Rome. You see them in the Vatican, museums throughout Italy, throughout the world. You see these works of art. So that's why I would say it was a combination of a spa, a bath, a fitness center, an entertainment complex, a convention center, an art museum, and a shopping mall on the same grounds. So that was something typical of Rome. It was not a one-use type of facility. But I mean, even today, even if you see it in ruins, it's impressive by any standard.
Yes.
I mean, the Caracalla baths.
There we go. Well, John, thank you very much for a lovely discussion about the hill. As I always figured, I can see why people so enjoy being taken around by you through the city, through your experiences, not experiences, that's not a word, and your richness on your point of view of things really does make the place come alive that other people may not have been able to experience otherwise. So thank you again, and I look forward to having you back for other podcasts.
And we look forward to all our listeners coming back to make actual tours in Rome, because to hear about it is one thing, but you've got to see it.
Of course. Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. So thanks everybody for listening in. And remember, if you have any questions for me or John about this episode, you can always write back to us on office@througheternity.com. Look forward to speaking to you next week. Ciao, ciao. Thank you for listening to our TE Talks with Guides. We have a new episode every Wednesday. Please subscribe to get an alert when each podcast comes out. Rate us and tell people how you enjoyed it, and share it on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Most importantly, if you enjoyed it, send us a feedback about the show. Also, if you are curious about what some of these people and places we talked about look like, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch the video on this podcast, where we have inserted special images for you to further enjoy the story.